Boa tarde a todas e todos e todos, and good afternoon, Mr. Tilley. É uma grande alegria recebê-los para esta conferência que integra a programação acadêmica do IV Congresso Internacional de Humanidades Digitais, Cultura e Ensino e V Simpósio Nacional em Mídias, Tecnologias e Histórias. Eu sou o professor Breno Rodrigo de Oliveira Alencar, professor do Instituto Federal do Pará, colegiado de História, e professor do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação, Cultura e Amazônia da Universidade Federal do Pará. Esta conferência reafirma a importância do diálogo internacional, interdisciplinar e crítico em torno das mídias, das culturas impressas, das infâncias, dos quadrinhos e das formas contemporâneas de participação cultural. Quero inicialmente dar as boas-vindas a todas as pessoas que nos acompanham nesta transmissão e agradecer de modo especial ao professor doutor Jorge Leonardo Seabra Coelho, professor da Universidade Federal do Tocantins e coordenador do Grupo de Pesquisa em Mídias, Tecnologias e História, Unitex, pelo convite para realizar a mediação desta conferência. Agradeço também à equipe envolvida na organização e na viabilização técnica desta atividade. Informo que nos bastidores da transmissão contamos com a presença e o acompanhamento do professor Jorge e no apoio técnico e tradução do professor Vitor Vaz Aires, também da Universidade Federal do Tocantins, a quem agradecemos pela colaboração. Temos hoje a honra de receber a professora Carol Tilley, professora associada da Universidade de Illinois, Estados Unidos, e pesquisadora reconhecida internacionalmente por suas contribuições aos estudos sobre quadrinhos, cultura impressa infantil, bibliotecas, letramento midiático e práticas de leitura de crianças e jovens. A professora Tilley possui doutorado em Ciências da Informação pela Universidade de Indiana e uma trajetória acadêmica que articula de maneira muito potente a história social da leitura, os estudos sobre juventude, os serviços bibliotecários para crianças e adolescentes, a cultura dos quadrinhos e os debates sobre mediação, acesso e formação crítica de leitores. Sua produção tem sido especialmente relevante por deslocar o olhar dos quadrinhos como simples objetos de entretenimento para compreendê-los como práticas culturais, sociais, educativas e políticas. Entre suas contribuições mais conhecidas, destaca-se o artigo Seducing the Innocent, Frederick Wertham and the Falsification That Helped Camden Comics, no qual revisita criticamente a obra e os argumentos de Frederick Wertham, figura central do movimento anti-quadrinhos nos Estados Unidos em meados do século XX. A professora Tilley também publicou trabalhos importantes como Superman Says, Read, National Comics and Reading Promotion, Children and the Comics, Young Readers' Takes on the Critics, além de estudos recentes sobre leitores jovens afro-americanos, cultura impressa e práticas históricas de participação em torno dos quadrinhos. A conferência de hoje tem como título Children Before Convergence, Comics Critical Literacy and the Political Economy of Participation, ou em tradução livre, Infâncias antes da Convergência, Quadrinhos, Letramento Crítico e Economia Política da Participação. A partir de uma abordagem histórica e crítica, a professora Carol propõe uma reflexão sobre a cultura da convergência, a transmedialidade e a cultura participativa antes da era digital. Tomando os quadrinhos e a cultura infantil como eixo analítico, sua conferência nos convida a repensar a participação cultural não apenas como criatividade ou engajamento, mas também como um fenômeno atravessado por relações de poder, pedagogia, mercado, trabalho, consumo e formação crítica. Trata-se, portanto, de uma contribuição muito importante para compreendermos que as crianças não foram apenas consumidoras passivas de produtos culturais. Elas participam, imaginam, criam, colecionam, escrevem, desenham, interpretam e produzem sentido em torno dos quadrinhos muito antes das plataformas digitais e das redes sociais. Ao mesmo tempo, a conferência nos ajuda a pensar os limites dessa participação, especialmente quando elas são vinculadas a sistemas comerciais, propriedades intelectuais e economias midiáticas. Dito isto, a conferência terá a seguinte dinâmica. A professora Carol Tilley terá até 40 minutos para sua exposição. Ao final, farei um breve resumo e apresentarei questões para o debate. Durante a transmissão, os participantes podem enviar suas perguntas, comentários e contribuições pelo chat. Ao final da conferência, faremos a leitura das perguntas selecionadas, que serão traduzidas para a conferencista, assim como suas respostas serão traduzidas para acompanhamento do público. I would like to reiterate our gratitude to Professor Carol Tilley for her generosity in sharing her research, experience, and reflections with us. It is a great pleasure to have her with us in this space of academic dialogue. Professor Carol Tilley, you are most welcome. The floor is yours.
Obrigada. Boa tarde a todos. Tenho o prazer de falar com você hoje. E agora, de volta ao inglês. Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to speak with you today. There we go. Henry Jenkins' book, Convergence Culture, entered our world 20 years ago. In it, Jenkins marshals ideas from diverse fields, including media history, literacy education, and cultural theory, alongside case studies around texts such as the television series Survivor and the film franchise The Matrix, to argue for a new way of understanding pop culture and mass media. Convergence culture, this new paradigm, is more than technological integration or even media consolidation. Instead, it is the reshaping of the public sphere, one that Jenkins hopes will lead to a new form of democratic political participation. Convergence culture has inspired media studies and fan scholars globally. In my own work as an information scientist, a comics scholar, and a historian of children's print culture, I have engaged with Jenkins' ideas. For a decade, I taught a graduate course on media literacy, in which my students and I explored Jenkins' concepts of transmedia storytelling, discussing how texts such as the Harry Potter series circulate globally through both sanctioned channels and in fan communities. Likewise, in my own historical scholarship of children's engagement with comics in the US, I have borrowed his theory of participatory culture to help describe the activities I recovered and documented. But equally, Jenkins' book has had its share of critics. For instance, a 2011 special issue of the journal Cultural Studies was dedicated to the critique of convergence culture for its historicity, its engagement with gender and other issues. In Brazil, scholars including Marco Antonio de Almeida have demonstrated how this country's unique social and political contexts, such as the role of traditional Brazilian cultures, complicate Jenkins' theories. Even Jenkins himself has offered some correctives, such as his 2008 afterword to the paperback version of Convergence Culture, in which he reminds readers that not all types and practices of participatory cultures lead to a more just and democratic world. Today, I want to join the critics and offer a reimagining of convergence culture, using some of my historical work on children and comics. In doing so, I propose that studying children's culture, especially around comics, can offer an important corrective to dominant theories of convergence culture. I intend to go beyond those theories that celebrate participation without sufficiently analyzing factors such as power, pedagogy, labor, and historical continuity. And I don't want this to be a US only cultural imperialist approach. So as I'm able, I will draw on Brazilian scholarship and examples from Brazilian comics culture. One of the key concepts Jenkins introduces in convergence culture is transmedia storytelling. He defines it as stories that unfold across multiple media platforms, with each medium making distinctive contributions to our understanding of the world, a more integrated approach to franchise development than models based on urtexts and ancillary products. From their earliest days in the US, comics have been harbingers of transmedia storytelling. Comics scholar Ian Gordon, in his 1998 book, Comic Strips and Consumer Culture, documents how Richard Outcault's 1902 comic strip Buster Brown is, quote unquote, the crucial link between comic strips and the development of a visual culture of consumption in America. In the United States, the character Buster Brown became an advertising powerhouse, appearing in perhaps 10,000 print advertisements. And his image could be found on playing cards, cigar packaging, scissors, spoons, plates, whistles, postcards, and more. While these examples are closer to the urtext and ancillary products that Jenkins says stand in contrast to transmedia storytelling, there are others that we might identify as closer fits. Buster Brown's primary story was told via the comic strips, but over several decades, the character's story was enriched via other media. For instance, there were books that collected or adapted some of the comic strips. Additionally, there were theater performances, radio shows, early films, and comic books that extended audiences' understanding of and engagement with the character. Many of these extensions had a distinctive commercial branding component, as it was the Brown Shoe Company that underwrote the production of some of the comic books and radio shows. Does this branding detract from the transmediality? Perhaps, since the character was used more to sell products than to tell a story. But we can turn to still other examples, such as how Buster Brown was borrowed for a children's jump rope rhyme that started something like, Buster Brown went to town with his pants on upside down. Even better, though, we have the example of Chiquinho, the character that spent 50 years in the pages of O Chico Chico. It started as an unauthorized adaptation of Buster Brown, eventually moving away from adaptation to its own story. Another pre-digital comics-related example of transmediality, Superman. First published in 1938 in the comics magazine Action Comics, Superman became popular among young readers almost instantly. That first issue of Action Comics had a print run of around 200,000 copies. But by the early 1940s, copies increased to perhaps 400,000 per issue and continued to grow until they likely reached 1 million copies per issue in the early 1950s. Superman appeared not only in Action Comics, but in his own magazine, Superman, as well as others such as World's Finest Comics, each with robust sales. As with Buster Brown, Superman became a staple figure of various advertising campaigns. His image shilled for products such as bubblegum, breakfast cereal, and gasoline. Additionally, one could purchase a variety of toys inspired by Superman, such as paper dolls, a wind-up airplane, a target shooting game, and even jigsaw puzzles. Children could dress in Superman shirts, wear a Superman watch and hat, and carry a Superman-themed bag to school. Again, these are not examples, perhaps, of true transmedia per Jenkins. They are only ancillary products. But they do speak to the inescapable nature of the Superman character, especially for children in the mid-20th century. Even more than Buster Brown, though, Superman offers us a true example of transmediality. Between 1938 and the mid-1950s, Superman was featured in a novelization, 3 regularly issued comic books selling millions of copies annually, several specialty comic books, such as the one that was produced for the 1939 World's Fair. He was featured in a comic strip that was syndicated in as many as 300 newspapers, a radio serial that aired more than 2,000 unique shows. There were public service messages printed in various comics magazines, an animated cartoon series, 2 live-action movie serials, a feature film, and a television series. While there was inevitably some overlap in the contents of these texts, many of them provided unique entry points and contributions to Superman's stories. For instance, the storyline for the feature film, Superman and the Mole Men, did not have a companion story in the comics. Likewise, in 1946, the radio show aired a several-part story in which Superman battles a fictionalized version of the hate group, the Ku Klux Klan, a storyline that did not find its way into the comics until Gene Luen Yang's 2019 limited series, Superman Smashes the Klan. In convergence culture, Henry Jenkins offers The Matrix as an example of transmedia storytelling. He writes, "The Matrix is entertainment for the age of media convergence, integrating multiple texts to create a narrative so large that it cannot be contained with a single medium." He points to the film, the webcomics, a computer game, another film, and an MMORPG, stating that the Wachowskis, quote, "played the transmedia game very well." I don't disagree with that assessment, but I would say that Superman beat Neo, Morpheus, and Trinity to the punch. DC National Comics, the company that holds the intellectual property rights for Superman, ensured that children and Superman's other readers and viewers had an ever-expanding story world in which to imagine their hero, just as Estúdios Mauricio de Souza has done in Brazil with Turma de Mônica. Children's culture and lived experiences are in many ways more ephemeral than comics. While we have all been children, few of us document those years in robust ways that can be shared with future generations. A few photos, perhaps some childhood drawings, a home movie, clippings from a newspaper, a favorite toy saved from destruction at the hands of a younger sibling. How does one give proof of participatory culture when so many of the primary documents are memories? That's a challenge I face in my work as I reconstruct children's relationships with comics and their engagement with popular culture. When Jenkins describes participatory culture, he emphasizes the relatively low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement, along with strong support for creating and sharing one's creations, an informal mentorship among experienced and novice participants. These characteristics are familiar to contemporary scholars looking at fandoms and similar communities, but they also describe children's comics culture decades before the internet. So allow me a moment for a personal story. When I began studying comics more than 20 years ago, I was primarily interested in gatekeepers, that is, teachers, librarians, and other adults who attempted to control children's access to comics. Along the way, I gained a small amount of fame for my work debunking psychiatrist Frederick Wortham. He was a key figure in the anti-comics movement in the US during the mid-20th century. And his ideas, expressed most notably in the 1954 book Seduction of the Innocent, proved popular in other countries, including Brazil. In fact, I had the pleasure of spending time in Sao Paulo several years ago and giving some talks about my comics work while I was there. But this paper brought me some fame also led to an important epiphany for me. As I looked around at the state of comics scholarship in the US, there were lots of papers and books examining things like the meaning of superheroes or the representation of women or the outputs of a particular publisher or cartoonist. Sometimes comics were the source texts for talking about bigger issues like war or immigration or feminism. What I didn't see was scholarship about how children and youth experienced comics, and I grew determined to change that fact. So for more than a decade, I've spent my time searching for evidence of children's participatory practices around comics during the mid-20th century. Why these years? Well, in the US, more than 95% of children read comics then. Not just occasionally, but frequently and sometimes obsessively. Sales were extraordinary, peaking in the early 1950s with nearly 1 billion new comics sold in the US in a single year. Part of the reason for Superman's transmedia successes is simply that there was an enormous market among children who wanted stories that spoke to their fantasies and fears, their impulses, and ideas. Despite so much evidence of children's historical and social practices around comics being mediated by not so impartial adults or lost to memory and death, I have found glimmers of what their participatory cultures around comics looked like. This evidence comes from a variety of sources, including newspaper human interest stories, published lists of fan club memberships, school newspapers and yearbooks, letters to comic book publishers, and this is 20 years before Marvel started publishing letters regularly, letters to cartoonists, even letters to adult gatekeepers. There are contest entries and comics published in newspapers. There are photographs of children reading comics, selling comics, playing with comics. There are traces of children's ownership and engagement left on comic books. I love that these 4 comics all belong to the same young person who wrote his name across all of them. And yes, there were also anecdotes in educational and communication studies from that time period. And there have been some self-published memoirs. And I've had a chance to do a few very limited oral histories. What I have learned in the process of gathering and analyzing these texts is just how extraordinarily rich this early participatory culture around comics was. Children did not simply consume comics, they integrated them into everyday life. Comic books, comic strips, and their characters and stories were not isolated texts, but social objects around which relationships, identities, and imaginative and civic practices formed. So let me offer an example to illustrate how comics helped forge identities and imaginative practices. For nearly a quarter of a century, Open Road for Boys, a US magazine for boys that was focused on sports, adventure, and cultural dialogue, sponsored a regular cartooning contest. The contest asked entrants to respond to a prompt featuring a short poem and accompanying single-panel cartoon. The cartoon typically placed a character in a fantastically improbable situation, and then entrants were asked to draw the scenario's resolution. For each contest, the magazine reproduced the first, second, and third place winners and paid them quite well for the time, $5, $3, and $2 respectively. And there were also 2 special mention and 8 honorable mention entries that were reproduced. The magazine also printed the names and cities for each entrant whose work it reproduced. And it reprinted the names and cities of several dozen additional entrants who were designated as honorable mentions, although their cartoons were not also included. A few years ago, I gathered names from about 12 random issues of Open Road for Boys from the years 1930, 1931, and 1932. I had done some previous work on this magazine and was also familiar with an anecdote by cartoonist Mort Walker, which had led me to believe that an unusual number of entrants had gone on to careers in cartooning, animation, fine arts, and related fields. And these are a few examples of cartoonists and animators who got their start in Open Road for Boys. With this extensive data set of about 1,000 names and access to US federal censuses, together with other records such as military draft registrations and school yearbooks, I sought to learn whether that hunch was correct. And it was. Of the more than 600 individuals I was able to document, approximately 1/3 of them went on to careers in the arts. They worked as architects, cartoonists, draftsmen, commercial artists, fine artists, and more. If these 600 individuals had been more representative of the US population at the time, only about 10 of them, not more than 200, only about 10 of them would have entered arts-based careers. While there are no neon signs pointing to clear and unequivocal examples of the Open Road contest promoting an early participatory culture, there are hints that it did. For example, the contest itself provided a low barrier to entry. One only needed a piece of paper, a pen and ink, and a postage stamp to participate. There were no requirements to be a subscriber to the magazine. Similarly, I would argue that there was strong support for participation via the opportunity to win a monetary prize and see one's name and creation in print. Finally, there appeared to have been informal opportunities for mentorship. For instance, looking at the patterns in entries, I was able to find examples where small groups of friends submitted entries together. Perhaps they discussed their plans or critiqued one another's work. Additionally, Mort Walker recalled that his participation in the contest led to pen pal friendships with other entrants. And I imagine at least some of the correspondence centered around cartooning. Many of the extant examples I have found of young people's engagement with comics lack the sort of rigorous evidence to make full claims that they are constituted participatory culture. At the same time, 2 things are clear to me. First, comics were about much more than reading. They supported purposeful sociality and collective interpretation. Second, even though much of the evidence is ephemeral, the practices and forms of participation they document have value and deserve wider recognition. This history matters because it complicates the tendency to see participatory culture as primarily a digital phenomenon. Digital network technologies expanded the speed, scale, and visibility of participation, but they did not create participation itself. Children were already participating in media cultures in sophisticated ways long before social media platforms existed. So let me turn forward to the contemporary world. A young person who passionately debates superhero continuity, collects franchise merchandise, or produces fan art is certainly participating in culture. Similarly, a youth who collects all the Terma Jamanica Jibis or decorates their school notebooks with Monica stickers is also participating in culture. But participation itself is largely insufficient. On its own, participation does not necessarily challenge unequal power structures. In fact, most of what counts as participation, both historically and in contemporary life, is deeply consumptive, captive to commercial systems. Participation is not synonymous with empowerment, and that's something that both Henry Jenkins and I agree on. Paulo Freire's theories of critical pedagogy provide a valuable corrective to some of the optimism surrounding convergence culture. For Freire, participation alone is not liberatory. What matters is whether participation produces critical consciousness, an awareness of the political and economic structures shaping one's life. Dialogue in Freire's work is meaningful only when it enables individuals to recognize and challenge systems of domination. Our contemporary media environments make this distinction especially visible. Today, corporations actively encourage fans to create content, circulate promotional material, and sustain engagement online. Social media platforms monetize interaction itself. Fan participation generates economic value through attention, data, and free promotional labor. For instance, a teenager who cosplays as their favorite manga character at a comics festival may be motivated to do so by their personal identification with that character. But their costuming also serves the interest of the publisher. Thus, what appears as community and creativity is often also a form of economic extraction. I would argue that, as with transmediality and participatory culture, these capitalist tensions did not suddenly emerge with networked digital life. Comics history reveals much older relationships between children's participation and commercial culture. Superman's vast transmedia world was not simply a storytelling achievement, it was also a strategy for cultivating long-term emotional attachment to intellectual property. The Open Road for Boys cartooning contests provided space for creative participation, but they also encouraged loyalty to the magazine, increased subscriptions, and likely encouraged participants to buy the pens and ink that were advertised in the magazine. Children learned to follow serialized narratives across media, recognize branded characters, and sustain effective investment over time. In this sense, comics, broadly defined, helped sensitize and prepare audiences for what we now call convergence culture. As a scholar, I enjoy recovering and sharing examples of the way children created their own popular and participatory cultures with and through comics. But I must also be cautious about romanticizing these practices. I must acknowledge that children are often highly social, imaginative, and emotionally engaged audiences. They're looking for ways to assert themselves in a world of adult gatekeepers. At the same time, they possess relatively little institutional or economic power. Their creativity may enrich media systems even while the ownership of the stories and characters that inspire them remain firmly in corporate hands. Brazilian scholars have long recognized these tensions. Discussions of comics in Brazil frequently involve questions of cultural dependency, nationalism, and critical literacy. Imported comics and characters circulate alongside local creations, leading to hybridization and sometimes unequal cultural relationships. Chiquinho's transformation from an unauthorized adaptation adaptation of Buster Brown into a more distinctive Brazilian character is one example of this process. The push in Brazil to reduce the influence of US comics paved the way for the creation of Turma da Mônica. Yes, Mônica remains deeply tied to Brazilian language and culture, but it is also a transmedia ecosystem that's spurred by some of the same economics impulses as those behind Superman, Naruto, and Tio Patinhas. And it exists in a context that makes it challenging for comics readers and creators from northern Brazil to feel included. So what? I began this talk by noting that Henry Jenkins and others have often framed convergence culture as a transformative new paradigm. I don't disagree that important transformations have occurred with the advent of the internet. But as historians, especially historians of children's culture and media, we can see longer continuities behind these changes. Children's culture, comics culture, was already transmedia before digital media. It was already participatory before the rise of social networks. It already blurred the boundaries between consumption and play, creativity, and social life. The network digital world did not create these practices, but it did intensify them and enhance their commodification through their incorporation in platform economies like YouTube. Studying children and comics allows us to rethink convergence culture from historical and political perspectives. It encourages us to ask not only how audiences participate, but also who benefits from participation, what kinds of literacy are being cultivated, what forms of citizenship and consumer identity are being produced. These questions move us beyond romanticized or celebratory narratives of participation toward a more critical understanding of media culture. To return briefly to Freire, education, literacy, and participation are never neutral. Likewise, comics and other media text, especially those for children, are not merely entertainment. They're pedagogical systems. They shape how young people understand stories, authority, community, consumption, and even democracy itself. Again, convergence culture did not begin with the internet. In many ways, it began in the bedrooms, playgrounds, classrooms, and comics collections of children long before digital media existed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tilley, for this wonderful conference. First in Portuguese and next in English. A conferência da professora Carol Tilley, como a gente pôde perceber, propõe uma revisão histórica e crítica da ideia de cultura da convergência, tal como formulada pelo Henry Jenkins. A tese central é que a convergência midiática, transmedialidade, e esse é um conceito importante de citar, e a cultura participativa não surgem com a internet, nem podem ser compreendidas apenas como fenômenos digitais. Ao recuperar a história da relação entre crianças e quadrinhos nos Estados Unidos, a professora Tilley aborda as aproximações também do caso brasileiro, demonstrando que crianças já participavam de culturas midiáticas complexas, criativas e socialmente significativas muito antes das redes sociais, das plataformas digitais e das economias algorítmicas. O principal objetivo da conferência é deslocar o debate da celebração abstrata da participação, da lógica de convergência, para uma análise mais densa de suas condições históricas, pedagógicas, econômicas e políticas. A professora Carol Tilley não nega a importância das formulações de Jenkins, ao contrário, reconhece sua força conceitual, sobretudo nas noções de narrativa transmídia e cultura participativa. Contudo, argumenta que essas categorias precisam ser historicizadas. A transmedialidade não começou com franquias digitais, como Matrix. Personagens como Buster Brown e, de maneira ainda mais expressiva, Superman, já circulavam por tiras, revistas, livros, rádio, cinema, animações, produtos licenciados, materiais escolares e campanhas publicitárias. Essa circulação constituía mundos narrativos ampliados, nos quais crianças não apenas acompanhavam histórias, mas aprendiam a reconhecer personagens, marcas, continuidades narrativas e formas de pertencimento afetivo. Um dos pontos mais relevantes da conferência é a distinção entre participação e emancipação. A partir do professor Paulo Freire, nosso patrono da educação, que é importante sempre reafirmar como um dos mais importantes patronos da educação, não só no Brasil, mas no mundo, um dos nossos autores mais traduzidos, a professora Tilley traz essa referência, ele afirma, a partir da conferência, né, que a participação por si só não é necessariamente libertadora. Para que tenha sentido crítico, precisa produzir conscientização, isto é, capacidade de reconhecer as estruturas políticas, econômicas e simbólicas que moldam a vida social. Essa retomada freiriana, portanto, funciona como uma correção ao otimismo excessivo que, por vezes, acompanha os estudos de fandoms e da cultura participativa. Participar de uma cultura midiática, desenhar personagens, colecionar revistas, debater continuidades narrativas ou produzir fanart pode ser criativo e significativo, mas também pode reforçar sistemas comerciais, fidelizar consumidores e gerar valor econômico para corporações. A pesquisa histórica apresentada nessa conferência evidencia que nos Estados Unidos, de meados do século XX, os quadrinhos eram uma das formas mais populares de cultura impressa infantil. Ela mostra que mais de 95% das crianças liam quadrinhos no período, com vendas que chegaram a quase 1 bilhão, né, de revistas em um único ano, no início da década de 1950. Lembrar, 1 bilhão naquele momento, né, 1950. A conferencista reconstrói práticas participativas a partir de fontes fragmentárias, cartas, concursos, anuários escolares, jornais estudantis, listas de fãs-clubes, memórias, fotografias, marcas deixadas nos próprios quadrinhos e relatos dispersos em estudos educacionais e comunicacionais. Essa operação metodológica é importante porque reconhece a dificuldade de estudar historicamente a infância. Muitas experiências infantis não foram arquivadas pelas próprias crianças, mas mediadas por adultos, instituições, editores e educadores. Entre os principais resultados de sua pesquisa está a análise dos concursos de cartoons da revista Open Road for Boys. A partir de edições das décadas de 1930, Tilley identificou mais de 600 participantes documentáveis, dos quais aproximadamente um terço seguiu carreiras ligadas às artes, como cartunistas, arquitetos, desenhistas, artistas comerciais e artistas plásticos. O dado sugere que essas práticas não eram apenas brincadeiras isoladas, elas podiam funcionar como espaços de socialização estética, formação informal, experimentação criativa e construção de identidades. Embora as evidências não permitam afirmar sempre com absoluta segurança que esses concursos constituíram uma cultura participativa nos termos contemporâneos e do Jenkins, né? Elas indicam baixa barreira de entrada, incentivo à criação, reconhecimento público e possíveis formas de mentoria informal. A crítica central da conferência recai sobre a economia política da participação. Os quadrinhos ofereciam às crianças espaços de imaginação, ludicidade e sociabilidade, mas também as inseriam em sistemas comerciais. O universo transmídia do Superman, por exemplo, não foi apenas uma realização narrativa, foi também uma estratégia de fidelização afetiva a uma propriedade intelectual. De modo semelhante, no Brasil, personagens como Chiquinho e, posteriormente, a Turma da Mônica revelam processos de hibridização cultural, nacionalização de modelos estrangeiros e constituição de ecossistemas transmídia. Acho que aqui também é importante lembrar do Zé Carioca, né, a sua função no contexto da própria Segunda Guerra Mundial, né, para pensar esse processo que a Tilley, inclusive, no mesmo contexto. Né. Assim, a infância aparece simultaneamente como sujeito criativo e como mercado, um público capaz de imaginar, apropriar-se e ressignificar personagens, mas também profundamente visado por sistemas de consumo. Não tem como a gente não fazer essa leitura, né, e lembrar de algumas questões, né, que dizem respeito ao nosso dia a dia, inclusive no Brasil, né, a nossa história contemporânea no Brasil. A expansão dos quadrinhos por meio dos estúdios de cinema, das plataformas de streaming, do YouTube, das redes sociais, intensificou o que já existia, mundos narrativos ampliados, consumo seriado, identificação afetiva, disputas morais e mercantilização da atenção. No Brasil, a nostalgia em torno da saída de programas infantis da TV brasileira, como TV Globinho, TV Colosso, Bom Dia e Companhia, né, pode ser lida como sintoma de uma transformação mais ampla. A infância deixou de ter certos espaços reconhecíveis na grade televisiva pública e migrou para ambientes digitais, mais fragmentados, personalizados e dependentes de plataformas. A pesquisa TIC Kids Online Brasil mostra que o YouTube é uma das plataformas mais acessadas por usuários de internet. O que eu estou tentando aqui é mostrar como essa conexão, né, essa lógica, né, de pensar essa transformação que os quadrinhos produziram também se reflete naquilo que a gente tem hoje como entretenimento infantil, né? E que vai ganhar uma nova dimensão com a transformação desses quadrinhos em roteiro de cinema. E aí a gente pensa que, por exemplo, em relação a essa pesquisa da TIC Kids, o maior percentual, né, é de 9 a 17 anos e, principalmente, né, de 9 a 12 anos também das crianças. Né? A mesma pesquisa destaca a necessidade de políticas públicas para a proteção de direitos no ambiente online. Essa mudança não significa apenas, né, que a televisão aberta fosse um espaço neutro ou plenamente educativo, né, olhando para a minha geração, né, dos anos 80 e 90. Ela também era atravessada por publicidade, disputas comerciais e pedagogias de consumo. No entanto, a passagem para plataformas digitais introduz novas camadas de opacidade, recomendação algorítmica, monetização da atenção, publicidade integrada ao conteúdo, produção infantilizada por influenciadores e menor previsibilidade sobre o que chega às crianças. A gente tem no Brasil, né, a Resolução 163 de 2014, que considera abusivo o direcionamento de publicidade e comunicação mercadológica à criança, o que torna ainda mais relevante discutir como essas práticas se reconfiguram em ambientes como o YouTube e o streaming. Por fim, né, penso que a conferência ajuda a gente a compreender algumas coisas também mais recentes, talvez de 5 anos para cá, compreender por que personagens infantis e juvenis se tornaram objeto de disputa ideológica. Né? O caso do John Kent, quem não se lembra, né? Filho de Clark Kent e Lois Lane, é exemplar. Né? A DC anunciou em 2021 que o novo Superman da Terra se assumiria bissexual em Superman. Sona Kal-El, né? Acho que era uma proposta, informação frequentemente simplificada no debate público como Superman gay. No Brasil, a controvérsia em torno de imagens do personagem beijando outro homem foi mobilizada por Maurício de Souza, não o Maurício de Souza, né, mas o Maurício Souza, então jogador de vôlei da seleção brasileira, em episódio analisado academicamente como um caso de disputa pública envolvendo homofobia, democracia e colisões morais. Posteriormente, ele foi eleito deputado federal por Minas Gerais, ou seja, em torno dessa temática há uma mobilização também moral, né, e, portanto, uma tentativa de capturar esse personagem para construir narrativas que segmentam, né, de acordo com o interesse político e ideológico dos grupos que estão ali no momento. Né. Mais recentemente, o debate sobre masculinidade, acho que todo mundo vai lembrar disso, né, gerou até uma se a gente pode chamar aquilo de debate, né, um debate na Globo News, aí do Brasil, né, falo aí do Brasil porque eu não estou no Brasil nesse momento, que é o caso do ator Juliano Casarré, com o curso Farol e a Forja. Né? Um dos detalhes interessantes dessa tentativa de, eu diria até de manipular esse debate, foi quando ele questionou a masculinidade do pai da Peppa Pig. Isso para falar de um momento em que as crianças já são socializadas com telefones, né, para assistir esses desenhos, né? Galinha Pintadinha, né? E aí a Peppa Pig aparece nesse cenário, né? E é um desenho, né? E aí se questionava a masculinidade do pai da Peppa Pig porque ele era um pai bobão, né? E isso está nesse debate aí do curso O Farol e a Forja. A contribuição, acho que decisiva, né, da professora Carol, está, portanto, em mostrar que os quadrinhos e as mídias infantis nunca foram apenas entretenimento. Eles são sistemas pedagógicos, econômicos e políticos. Produzem imaginação, mas também disciplina, ludicidade, mas também consumo, identificação, mas também disputas sobre gênero, autoridade, família, cidadania e democracia. A infância, nesse quadro, não está simplesmente fora do projeto midiático. Ela está, muitas vezes, no centro do debate econômico, mas nem sempre como sujeito autônomo. Acho que o desafio aqui é recolocar as crianças como intérpretes, criadores e cidadãos, e não apenas como consumidoras de dados ou público capturado. Acho que esse é o grande debate que a professora Carol chama a atenção. E aí eu queria pensar, né, com a professora Carol, vou fazer a pergunta primeiro em português, e vou tentar traduzir, né, o meu inglês não é o dos melhores, e eu quero agradecer novamente a presença do Vitor, que está aqui conosco para auxiliar nesses momentos de dificuldade. A professora Carol, né? Se os universos de super-heróis hoje são majoritariamente expandidos por grandes estúdios, plataformas de streaming, franquias globais e estratégias de propriedade intelectual, em que medida ainda resta às crianças um espaço efetivo para imaginar destinos próprios para seus personagens, em que medida essa imaginação já nasce previamente orientada por interesses comerciais, algoritmos e disputas ideológicas adultas. A migração uma segunda questão, né? A migração da cultura infantil da TV aberta para o YouTube, streaming e redes sociais ampliou a autonomia das crianças ou apenas transferiu suas experiências lúdicas para ambientes menos transparentes, né? Mais individualizados e mais intensamente monetizados? Como pensar políticas de letramento crítico que não sejam moralistas, mas que ajudem crianças a compreender publicidade, recomendação algorítmica, consumo e representação? E aí, por fim, né, quando personagens como John Kent, Papai Pig e super-heróis de grandes franquias se tornam alvos de disputas sobre gênero, família, masculinidade e sexualidade, estamos diante de uma defesa da infância ou de uma tentativa adulta de controlar sua imaginação? O que significa reconhecer as crianças como sujeitos capazes de interpretação sem ignorar que elas estão expostas a fortes assimetrias de poder econômico, político e simbólico? In English, if superhero universe today are mostly expanded through major film studios, streaming platforms, global franchises, and intellectual property strategies, to what extent do children still have an effective space to imagine their own destinies for these characters? And to what extent is that imagination really shaped in advance by commercial interests, algorithms, and adult ideological disputes? Has the migration of children's culture from broadcast television to YouTube, streaming services, and social media expanded children's autonomy? Or has it merely transferred that playful experience to environments that are less transparent, more individualized, and more intensely monetized? How can we think about critical literacy policies that are not moralistic, but that help children understand adversity, algorithmic recommendation, consumption, and representation? Sorry. When characters such as John Kent, Daddy Pig from Peppa Pig, or superheroes from major franchise become charged of disputes of gender, family, masculinity, and sexuality, are we witnessing a defense of children's role and adult attempt to control children's imagination? What does it mean to recognize children as subjects capable of interpretation, while also acknowledging that they are exposed to strong asymmetries of economic, political, and symbolic power? Thank you, Mr. Tilley.
Yes. Obrigada, Breno, pelas excelentes preguntas. So to start with your first question, I think that one of the things that it's important for me to differentiate is that I think that digital technologies generally have perhaps expanded the spaces that young people have for the things you said, to imagine their own destinies for characters. I think that when it comes to the ways that corporations have implemented or promoted these digital technologies, I think that that is where you see that that space being restricted and shaped too much by algorithms and the kinds of concerns that adults have that children may not. I think about even more spaces like Roblox that are not necessarily tied to a particular character or intellectual property. But the fact that this platform, this gaming platform that so many young people participate in is owned by a company that has a lot of interest in data mining, in data selling of various kinds. I think that that is where my concern is. I think that there are certainly changes from when I was a child, in a pre-digital, pre-networked era, where play happened, yes, perhaps with toys that were branded in particular ways, but you could do what you wanted to with them. And I think that has changed too, where you have toys which require a digital connection or they have to be plugged into a computer. I think that is a problem. I do also have some confidence that young people will find ways to subvert corporate intentions. So this is an older example, but I remember a few years ago, a student told me that her younger sister and her younger sister's friends were using Instagram not to share photos, but that they were using it to chat with one another because it was more private than the other possibilities that they had. So I think that there are still possibilities. I will tell you that I do. One of the things I've noticed that I think speaks to some of the ways that the corporations and the digital world have closed off opportunities. I've noticed that with some of my younger students, those born since the year 2000, when I ask them about their childhoods and I ask them to recall specific things, they have a difficult time doing that. A lot of their memories and experiences seem to run together. That's not the case with my older students who had experience in a pre-digital world. And I think sometimes that there's something about existing in a primarily digital landscape that gives us a different set of memories or a different set of contexts than those of us who grew up playing and learning in a pre-digital world, in a physical world. So I will stop there.
Thanks. Vitor, eu estou notando que a gente tem muitas perguntas chegando pelo chat. Eu te pediria, por gentileza, que compartilhasse, né, conosco e também comentasse. O Vitor é nosso colega, está aqui conosco, é mestrando da Universidade Federal de Tocantins e está pesquisando, inclusive, né, ao redor dessa temática. Então, eu queria até pedir ao Vitor, por favor, que se apresentasse, falasse um pouco e trouxesse essas perguntas que estão circulando pelo chat.
Ok. Olá a todos, boa tarde. Eu estava aqui enquanto a professora estava fazendo sua excelente apresentação, que falou de tópicos muito importantes, e eu sou aluno da UFT, da Universidade Federal de Palmas, ou de Tocantins. Eu estou agora cursando um mestrado de letras, mais especificamente na parte de linguística. E eu vim aqui convidado para fazer essa ponte, né, entre os participantes, as pessoas que estão assistindo e a professora. Então, eu anotei aqui o que vocês estavam escrevendo durante a apresentação. Eu vou fazer aqui, perguntar para a professora. Também tem alguns comentários. Então, vamos passar para essa parte. So, teacher.
Yes.
Isabel Cristina Rodrigues, she made a comment here, first of all. In Brazil, teachers use comics to discuss some of the issues you mentioned, but not necessarily to explore children's exploration or enjoyment regarding reading comics or cartoons.
I think it's much the same here in the US. I think in the last 20 years that comics have been growing and becoming a more normal part of the school space. I think that teachers know that children enjoy reading comics, and I think often they try to find ways of making the reading experience more overtly pedagogical. I think that here in the US, there is a lot of anxiety about ensuring that children are learning and growing and, making progress to be successful adults. And I think as a whole that we don't give them a lot of space just to play and enjoy. And I think that's something we can do more of. Just let kids be kids, let kids read comics for fun. Not everything has to be about teaching or about learning.
Então, sobre esse comentário, né, que os professores aqui no Brasil utilizam esses quadrinhos para fazer discussões sobre esses problemas que a gente vê e que foram mencionados durante a apresentação, mas não necessariamente para explorar o quanto essa criança está aproveitando essa leitura, o quanto que ela está gostando. A professora falou que é a mesma coisa nos Estados Unidos. Às vezes os quadrinhos são usados apenas de forma para falar sobre uma discussão sobre esses problemas que a gente tem no mundo e durante a cultura, na sociedade, mas às vezes não é utilizado para apenas o entretenimento, ou senão apenas para diversão. Então, é uma coisa que nós podemos estar vendo mais, né? Porque não é apenas para uma forma de progresso, não é apenas para ter uma finalidade, às vezes pode ser apenas para diversão. Aqui para o segundo comentário. So the second comment of Alice Soares. Excellent explanations. Congratulations to the professors for bringing up important topics for discussion.
I'll just say thank you. Comics, here in the US, many people still view comics with some prejudice, that they are not serious or valuable. And in all that I try to do, I try to highlight both the cultural importance of comics and also the importance of listening to children.
Que está agradecendo, né, o comentário e fazendo essa pauta, né, que quadrinhos não são muito levados a sérios ainda, né, mas eles são uma excelente plataforma para fazer esse tipo de diálogo. Agora uma pergunta aqui, ó. Now a question of Isabel Cristina Rodrigues. How to promote these dialogues when children are left out to watch without any kind of supervision?
I think that's a difficult question, and one that is not relevant only in Brazil, but here as well. I think that in my own teaching, for instance, I teach people who are going to become librarians. And one of the things that I encourage them, and that is part of being a librarian in the US, is creating spaces, having programs where young people can have these kinds of conversations, the kinds of conversations that may not take place at home or in school. And I think that there is a role for that in libraries. And I think in schools as well, there can be more conversation around critical literacy, around media literacy, at a more in-depth level.
Ok. Então, mais uma pergunta aqui que a Isabel fez, né, que é como nós podemos promover esses diálogos quando as crianças são deixadas para assistir sem nenhuma forma de supervisão. Então, a professora está falando que é um tópico bem difícil, né, de falar, que também acontece nos Estados Unidos, e que nós podemos colocar esses assuntos dentro das escolas e dentro das bibliotecas, que como um dos papéis de bibliotecários é realmente fomentar esse tipo de conversa, né? E também um espaço muito importante para esse tipo de conversa seria as próprias escolas. Agora, outra pergunta aqui da Adriane da Silva. So, a question here. Good afternoon. I would like to know from the professor how she views Marvel Comics books, specifically the X-Men, in relation to gender studies and female representation.
That is also a good question. And I'm probably not the best person to answer. I can recommend, however, the work of a friend and colleague of mine named Samantha Langsdale. And she has written both essays and a book looking at women in Marvel Comics. And I think that would be, her work would be a great source. Strangely enough, I am not a big superhero comics reader. I love reading comics, but I don't read a lot of superhero comics, aside from Wonder Woman. So.
Okay. Então, aqui, a pergunta aqui da Adriane. Boa tarde, gostaria de saber da professora como ela vê as histórias em quadrinhos da Marvel, especificamente dos X-Men, nos estudos de gênero e representatividade feminina. Então, a professora falou que isso é um ponto muito bom de discussão e muito interessante, mas que ela não tem muita expertise desse assunto. Então, ela indicou um outro estudioso sobre isso, e também colega dela, que é a Samantha Lansdale, que ela tem uma obra especificamente falando sobre isso, dos X-Men. E, apesar da professora ter muito esse contato com os quadrinhos, ela não é uma leitura tão grande dessa parte de super-heróis da Marvel. Mas, novamente, ela reforça aqui a obra, né, da Samantha Lansdale. Então, para quem fez essa pergunta, seria interessante fazer essa pesquisa. Eu acho que é isso daí, então, sobre as perguntas. Okay. So thank you, Professor. This was the questions that the participants made. I will let the stage for the professor.
Vitor, eu estou vendo uma mensagem da Isabel Cristina. Isabel Cristina Rodrigues.
Sim, desculpa, ainda não tinha carregado aqui. So, another comment of Isabel. Libraries are excellent spaces to promote learning and sharing experiences. Not many libraries in Brazil have that kind of program.
I would say that it's true here too. I am working to change that. I think that it takes library staff, librarians who have a lot of dedication and interest in promoting that kind of programming. It's certainly not something you will find in every library in the U.S.
Então, sobre esses tópicos, né, que estão discutindo nas livrarias, não, nas bibliotecas, e sobre esses programas, né, para ter esse tipo de discussão, também é um cenário parecido nos Estados Unidos. E isso acaba que cai nas costas dos próprios funcionários criar esse tipo de programa. Então, tem que ter realmente uma paixão e dedicação a mais para promover esse tipo de discussão e de conhecimento.
Eu queria registrar a diversidade, né, de participantes. A gente nota que tem colegas aqui de diferentes cidades do Brasil e do mundo. Então, queria deixar registrado, né, a importância desses encontros, né, e também parabenizar e agradecer o Vitor pela disponibilidade dele em fazer as traduções. Entendo que, não havendo mais comentários, a gente pode caminhar para o encerramento. Tudo bem? In this moment, Carol,
Yes.
we go to the end of the conference, okay?
Sure.
Professor Carol Tilley, on behalf of the organization of this event, I would like to express our sincere gratitude for your availability, your intellectual generosity, and the quality of the conference you have just shared with us. Your presentation offered a very important contribution to our reflection on comics, children's culture, critical literacy, and cultural participation beyond an exclusively digital or contemporary perspective, by historically recovering the relationship among children, comics, print, culture, consumption, imagination, and the political economy of participation. Your talk helps us understand that process of culture mediation are always shaped by powers, relations, pedagogy, symbolic disputes, and forms of subjective formation. Também agradeço ao público que nos acompanhou, enviou perguntas, comentários e contribuições pelo chat, tornando este momento ainda mais rico e dialógico. Agradeço de modo especial ao professor Jorge Seabra, né, pelo convite, pela condução institucional dessa atividade, ao professor Vitor, pelo apoio técnico fundamental para a realização da transmissão. Eu queria ainda compartilhar, né, o que a gente pode dizer que é até uma notícia importante, né, a gente quer traduzir essa conferência da professora Carol Tilley para publicar na revista Convergência. A gente acredita que essa publicação permitirá ampliar o acesso ao texto, especialmente para leitores e leitoras de língua portuguesa, fortalecendo o diálogo acadêmico sobre quadrinhos, infância, cultura midiática, letramento crítico e participação. We hope this conference will be only the beginning of new chances, collaborations, and intellectual encounters. Professor Tilley, Carol Tilley, please receive once again our deep gratitude for your presence, your trust, and your generosity in sharing your research with us. Thank you very much, and have an excellent afternoon.
Obrigada.